Okay, so I'm back reviewing another rod, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Syndicate Pipeline P2 11-foot 3-weight. This is my favorite Euro nymphing rod I've owned. Some things I like about this rod. First of all, it's a good looking rod, especially for no more expensive than it is. It's got a nice wood insert in the reel seat. It's got pretty good cork on it. The blank is a color I really like. I don't know really how to describe it, and I'm sure it won't show up on this video, but to my eye, it almost looks like a very muted brown, but I like the color a lot. And as far as the actual fishability of this rod, the action is very pleasant. It's got a very soft tip, so this rod really shines with lighter flies, throwing dry droppers, or nymphing with really light flies. So something like a 2mm, 2.5mm bead for your point fly is where this rod really shines, just because that light tip can cast those flies really well. You can get pretty long casts with this rod. And that tip also helps this rod have really great strike detection. It's very sensitive, and it has great tippet protection as well. Now, this rod's weaknesses show up when you start fishing jig streamers. I should also mention it's pretty light. For an 11-foot rod, it's pretty lightweight. I don't know if I said that already or not. But when you start fishing jig streamers on it, which I do quite a bit of, the weaknesses of this rod start to show up. It doesn't like heavier flies. It'll handle, a 4.5mm bead for a point fly. But when you start getting into really heavy stuff, like a 5.5mm bead, or I fish a lot of jig streamers that have dumbbell eyes on them, and I will, even in extreme high water conditions, I will fish jig streamers that I have tied out of like crappie jigs, basically jig heads, and this rod does not like those. It won't false cast them really. I have fished other 10-foot 3-weights that will false cast those. They've got enough backbone to do it. This one does not, in my opinion. So when I'm fishing, if I have to fish really heavy, if I know I'm going to fish really heavy stuff, this is just not the rod I grab. But if I wind up fishing dumbbell eyes or really big, heavy jig streamers on this, it becomes more of a chuck and duck, spin fishing type cast, as opposed to actually making false casts with those jig streamers like some of my other rods will. And then the other issue, a couple other issues with this rod fishing jig streamers or really heavy things. One being that, on these jig streamers, you have heavier wire hooks typically, much heavier wire than your little nymphs and whatnot. So when you actually go to set the hook on this, that soft tip really becomes your demise. I've had a lot of fish come off just because this rod doesn't really have the backbone to be getting good hook sets with, size 2 streamer hooks. It just doesn't have the oomph to drive that wire into that fish's mouth. Whereas some of the shorter rods I've fished, 10-foot 3-weights, that don't have that light of a tip, that don't do as well with really light flies, but they can really drive home a pretty good sized hook if you really crank on them. Now, any Euro rod, you're going to have to really crank on it to set the hook on with a heavy wire like that. But this one just still struggles, even with a pretty aggressive hook set. And the other thing about this rod is, even though it is light for an 11-foot rod, it's still an 11-foot rod. And when I fish jig streamers, I'm doing a lot of jerk strip retrieves, and doing that all day, that motion with an 11-foot rod and a heavy fly on there, that 11-foot rod just has a lot of leverage over your wrist, so your wrist will get tired doing that, more tired than it will with a shorter rod. And you run into the same issue when you throw an actual fly line on here. So I have fished a real fly line here, 4-weight line, plenty of times. As you guys probably already know, I like to overline my Euro rods if I'm throwing an actual fly line on them. So I've fished dry flies and light nymph rigs with a 4-weight line with this rod, and it actually does really well. I like the way that that this rod casts a fly line, and I have a couple friends who guide with the 10-foot 3-weight a lot with real fly lines on them, and that's one of their main guide rods. But again, with this one being an 11-foot rod, it's a lot of leverage, and even though it's light for an 11-foot, it's still an 11-foot rod, and you do wind up, I think, if you fish a real fly on this all day, you start feeling it in your wrist, just getting a little bit cumbersome. So if you're gonna fish, if you're gonna do a lot of going back and forth between a real fly line and a Euro rig, the 11-foot might not be for you. If you're gonna fish a lot of jig streamers, the 11-foot's probably not for you. I would look into a shorter rod, maybe a 10-foot 3-weight Syndicate P2. It's not a rod I personally have a lot of experience with, so I can't tell you if it's gonna have enough backbone to drive home a jig streamer, but in general, I have found that 10-foot 3-weights do better with that. And one more thing I don't like about this rod is it does have a hook keeper, which to some people is a plus. If you watch my last video, you know I am not a fan of those. It does get in the way of my finger right there, and it's just an irritating thing for me to have there. But that's my personal little gripe. All in all, this is a fantastic rod. If I'm doing 99% of my Euro nymphing, this is my rod of choice. Syndicate also does make a higher end rod than this, the Reaver, I think is what they call it. And I've heard it's a great rod. I'm just not a fan of it because it's a like a synthetic grip. And that was honestly the biggest reason that I went with the P2 and not the Reaver is I don't like that. Call me old fashioned. I like cork under my hand. So I do love this rod. I have recommended this rod to a lot of clients, and I think if you're looking to do, you know, pretty much, if you're looking for an exclusive Euro nymphing rod, you're not going to throw really heavy stuff with it, but you want to be able to do light to medium work with it, this is a fantastic rod. This is the one I would suggest for you. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks, guys.